This drives my Christian friends crazy when I say this, but I tell them, if everything in the Bible happened exactly as it said, literally, I say, what's the big deal?
I recently came across this clip from a channel called Jonathan Bai, I think is how I say his last name, Bai. If that's not right, please correct me. But Jonathan is making a claim that I wanted to engage with. I came across Jonathan's channel because he was doing content on Homer's Odyssey, and it was really informative, and I could tell that he was kind of a kindred spirit who loved philosophy and the classics, so I made sure to follow. And this clip kind of came onto my feed, and once he kind of stepped into the world of theology, I felt like I wanted to say something about it, just because I love the classics, but I don't read Homer in the original Greek. I'm not a professional philosopher, but I am trained in theology. So this is more just engaging with some comments that he made, offering my own perspective on it. I love connecting with people who have a shared love for, the classics and poetry. So this is not in an antagonistic way. This is more just engaging with some of the thoughts that he had shared about the Bible and Jesus and theology in general. Let me play the clip that I saw first, and then we can dive in.
If everything in the Bible happened exactly as it said, literally, I say, what's the big deal? Resurrection? That happens all the time. Pagan gods get resurrected all the time.
It does.
Empty tomb, Tibetan Buddhists today, their bodies disappear, rainbow bodies, very well reported. Miracles, there's a lot cooler miracles in the history of religion than multiplying fish and turning water into wine, right? Eternal life, Taoism, forgiving sins, tantric masters taking up people's karma and then resolving it. And I ask them, it drives them crazy, right? Like, what is the big deal? Even claiming that he's God. I and the Father are one. This is a common claim within Indian mystics.
So I think it's clear from that clip that Jonathan has in mind the Gospels, specifically the four accounts of Jesus's life and ministry. Those were all of the examples that he was giving. So I'll limit myself to the Gospels. And I think it would be fair to kind of summarize his point as saying that even if the Gospels were entirely and literally true, they would be unremarkable and no big deal. And to support this claim, he kind of points to similar or identical claims in other religions and traditions, and even sharing that maybe other religions and traditions have more impressive, miraculous claims. I think that's a good summary of the case that he's making. That's the general thrust of the argument that I got from that clip. First thing I wanted to say was that I do think that Jonathan maybe moves a little too quickly past whether it's true. He kind of, for the sake of argument, concedes, even if the Gospels were true, they're not even that impressive. But I would actually want to camp out on that first point for a little bit longer. Even if they were true, the veracity of the claims in the Gospels, I think, is the entire point. I think, in fact, I would say whether they're true or not matters a lot more than whether they're unique, if that makes sense. Just because multiple people are saying similar or even identical things, what matters more is whether those claims are true than if they're unique. For an analogy, we could imagine if you were in the desert, stranded, you've gone 3 days without water, and you see, say, 5 signs that are all pointing in different directions, and they all say, the only source of water is in this direction. And each one's kind of pointing, in a different direction. It matters a lot less that they're all making the same claim than whether any of them is actually telling the truth. And if you find out which one is true, then I think it kind of becomes irrelevant whether there were other signs saying the same thing. The veracity of the claim is more important than its uniqueness. So I think Jonathan is moving a little too quickly past, even if it's true, they're unremarkable. Well, if it were true, then that's the remarkable claim. So I just think that focusing on uniqueness rather than the truthfulness is just a mix-up of priorities. I think it's more important whether the claim is true than if it's unique. Secondly, Jonathan kind of suggests that the miracles in the Gospels are unimpressive, that, turning water into wine or feeding, or multiplying food to feed thousands is, kind of relatively unimpressive when compared to maybe the miraculous claims in other texts or traditions. But I actually would argue that the tameness or unremarkableness of the miracles, as compared to some of the other traditions and mythologies, is kind of the point. I think it's what separates the claims of the Gospels from being just another pagan mythology. It reminds me of an interview with Martin Shaw, who articulated this point really well, I think. Martin Shaw is a storyteller and a mythologist who recently converted to Christianity. He started following Jesus because he became convinced that Jesus was the fulfillment of everything that he loved about pagan mythologies. And this is what Martin Shaw had to say about the miracles recorded in the Gospels.
During this period of your life, how did you regard Christ? As another myth among many? What was the sort of way in which you sort of thought about that?
He's definitely not he's not a myth amongst many. How people can say with a kind of great wave of the hand, well, of course, you also have Osiris and you have Dionysus and all of this stuff. Speaking as someone that has a new version of the Bacchae coming out, Euripides' play on Dionysus, very soon, I can tell you that those figures, although there's an ornamental connection through things like the vine and wine, you're never in a million years going to encounter something like the Sermon on the Mount coming out of Dionysus' mouth. I found Christ disturbing. So actually, I knew enough to know that the Christ story didn't fit neatly with any of the other mythologies that I was exploring, although there was connective thread. What disturbed me about the Gospels was that it sounded awfully like they had a postcode to them. Do you know what I'm saying? It's very site-specific. You don't get this in the Gnostic Gospels. The Gnostic Gospels were all floating around like astronauts, and it's the same old, same old. If you've read mystical content, you've read that before. Okay. But the Gospels are gnarly and strange, and they're all happening in an area that you can walk around. You know, you can walk around with a map. Yeah. And I thought, oh, that's a little bit too much like real life for me. I better stay away from it.
He's saying the miracles in the Gospels feel like they're making historical claims. These aren't just myths about Zeus or Odin or pagan gods that are dying and resurrecting in some land somewhere. They have a postcode to them. I like how he says that. This idea that these are actual historical claims that could be verified or unverified, and that whether they're important or significant depends greatly on whether or not they are true or not. It's not like Zeus or the story of the Odyssey, where whether or not there was really, a Trojan horse, the story still stands. The stories in the Gospels are not like that. Whether or not Jesus actually did these things and was who he says he was completely changes whether the text actually means something to us or not. And the humility, the unremarkableness, the tameness of the miracles that Jesus performs in the Gospels compared to, maybe other religions is, I think, kind of the point. It shows that this is claiming to be something actually historical. It's not like Jesus, I don't know, split the planet in half and then had his disciples, dive through the planet. Like, that would be a very remarkable miracle, but it would feel like mythology and not history. And so I think the tameness and maybe the unimpressiveness of the miracles suggest that they are to be taken as actual history and not just as one more pagan mythology. And the third point that I wanted to make was Jonathan says that if the entirety of the Gospels were true, then they still wouldn't be unique. And I find that to be, it makes me wonder if Jonathan has read all the Gospels. Maybe he has, but when you have claims in the Gospel like Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, no one comes to the Father except through me. For that claim to be true, it must necessarily be unique. I can imagine a scenario in which Jesus is lying or believes himself to be telling the truth, but it's actually not true. This is kind of a bit of the liar, lunatic, Lord argument. But Jesus could be claiming to be the only way to the Father and actually be wrong, or he could claim to be the only way to the Father and be correct. But the one thing he can't be is correct, but also not unique, because I guess, I don't know, maybe I just don't see how Jesus could actually be the only way to the Father but also not be unique. That seems to me like, by definition, that cannot be true. So Jonathan was more looking at maybe some of the miracles that he was performing, but he does eventually dip into the claims, the theological claims that Jesus makes, like saying that I and the Father are one. But it's, if we're going to dip into even the theological claims and saying, even if those were true, they're not remarkable. When the claim is, I am the only way to the Father, I think that is by definition unique. And the fourth thing I wanted to bring up, and this is maybe one of the most important things because it often gets overlooked, is the identity of the Father that Jesus is saying he is one with, is really important to understand. And this is where, even though we're technically limiting ourselves to the Gospels, Jesus is not operating in isolation. He is a Jew in first century Palestine, and when he is referring to God the Father, he is referring to the God of, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, there is a storied history that he is referring to, and he's saying that God is the one that I am one with. So, in other words, I'm saying Jesus is not identifying himself with a vague world spirit or ground of being. Jesus is claiming that there is a sole creator of the universe who made human beings in his image, who then entered into covenant with one particular nation of those people for the explicit purpose of blessing all the other humans based on that covenant with that one nation. And then Jesus is saying, I and that God are one. And I think that's a very unique claim. I just find it hard to believe that a Tibetan monk is claiming identity with the God of Israel. I'm not very well versed in Tibetan monks or, really much of Eastern mysticism or spirituality. So I'm more than happy to be corrected. But I think Jesus' claim to be one with the Father, which that's a whole nother door. The fact that he's calling him Father, not just God, that's actually unique from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, nobody really called God Father. He was the father of the nation of Israel, but not of any one particular person. And so the fact that Jesus is saying he's one with the Father is indicating that he has a very unique relationship, that there's an actual familial relationship between him and the Father. And the claim is, through the rest of Jesus' ministry, that through Jesus, you too can have that familial relationship with the God of Israel. I think that's a very unique claim. And I think flattening it out to just saying, to kind of just, oneness with the ground of being, really kind of ignores the uniqueness of the God of Israel, the entire Old Testament that Jesus is kind of assuming. And so when he says, I and the Father are one, I think it's a very unique claim that is very different from any Tibetan monk or, holy man in any other religion. And so finally, this is kind of my final thing that I wanted to hit on. I would love to invite Jonathan or anybody else who loves, pagan mythology or classical poetry. I love those things as well, to investigate the historical claims about Jesus. And doing it seriously, because there is a long line, especially actually recently, of people who love the classics, investigating the historical claims of Jesus and coming out the other side as followers of Jesus, seeing him not as opposed to the thing that they love, but seeing all of the classical literature that they love and are familiar with as pointing to and finding their fulfillment in Jesus Christ. I mentioned Martin Shaw earlier. I would highly recommend anybody go watch the rest of that interview. I'll put the link, even maybe right here in the video, for you to watch the whole entirety of that video. It's just fascinating to hear a mythologist who came to faith just in the last few years, started following Jesus. I would also say there's a few other names that you could look into, like Molly Worthen, James Orr, Paul Kingsnorth, and of course, the Titan, the GOAT, C.S. Lewis. I would highly recommend anybody check out C.S. Lewis, who His kind of conversion to Christianity is pretty well known to evangelicals. He was kind of a classicist. He loved especially, Beowulf and the Norse gods and mythology, and saw it originally as opposed to faith in Christ, but eventually, through his friendship with Tolkien, kind of saw Jesus as the true myth, the God who fulfills all the myths that he loves, but in actual fact and in a historical event, not just in a story. I wanted to finish this video by reading from his essay, Myth Become Fact. Now, as myth transcends thought, incarnation transcends myth. The heart of Christianity is a myth which is also a fact. The old myth of the dying God, without ceasing to be myth, comes down from the heaven of legend and imagination to the earth of history. It happens at a particular date, in a particular place, followed by definable historical consequences. We pass from a Balder or an Osiris, dying nobody knows where or when, to a historical person crucified under Pontius Pilate. By becoming fact, it does not cease to be myth, and that is the miracle. And then he ends with this: God is more than a god, not less. Christ is more than Balder, not less. There are many, many Christians who saw the pagans not as fools, but as believing in something that ultimately had its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. So Jonathan is asking whether Christianity would be meaningful or unique or impressive, even if the Gospels were true. And I think that kind of is beside the point. I think whether it is true is the core question. Because if it is, then it is necessarily the most important thing in the world. And if it is not, then it does not matter. Thanks for watching.